Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. On July 5th, 2015, just outside Bardstown, Kentucky, a white 2007 Chevrolet Impala was found abandoned on the shoulder of the Bluegrass Parkway. The driver's side door was unlocked. Inside, investigators documented a purse still buckled into the passenger seat, a cell phone lying face down on the center console, and a set of keys untouched in the ignition. The vehicle was completely intact. The fuel tank was half full. There were no signs of struggle, forced entry, or an accident. Just silence. And a woman named Crystal Rogers who had simply vanished. The responding Nelson County deputy on scene radio dispatch within minutes. No visual on occupant. Cars cold. No footprints leading away. The scene presented itself as sterile, too sterile. Not a drop of blood, not a scuff mark, not even a fingernail fragment. The environment was eerily undisturbed. The car hadn't just been abandoned, it had been placed. Crystal Rogers, age 35, was officially reported missing later that day by her mother, Tommy Ballard. When officers asked why her long-term boyfriend and live-in partner, Brooks Houck, hadn't reported her absence, Sherry's response was immediate and chilling. Because he already knew she wasn't coming back. In the hours that followed, Crystal's family began their own parallel search. Flyers were printed. Social media posts circulated her photo. Volunteers scoured the roadsides, creek beds, and forested areas of Nelson County. They called out her name into wind and silence. But even from the first day, those closest to her expressed doubt that Crystal was simply missing. Their tone wasn't one of hope. It was one of certainty that something had gone very wrong. Law enforcement launched a formal missing persons case within 24 hours. Crystal was listed as endangered. Investigators reviewed the known timeline. July 3rd, Crystal was last seen alive at the home she shared with Brooks and their 2-year-old son. According to Brooks's statement, the two stayed up late watching television. He claimed she left their home sometime during the night, allegedly upset. No witnesses could confirm seeing her leave. No phone calls were placed. No messages were sent. Her last digital footprint was a routine text sent earlier that afternoon. After that, nothing. In his first interview with detectives, Brooks was polite but emotionally flat. He denied any involvement, insisted their relationship was stable, and expressed mild confusion about her whereabouts. He agreed to a preliminary interview but declined to take a polygraph test. When pressed, he stated, "I don't need a machine to tell the truth for me." A search warrant was drafted but initially denied due to lack of probable cause. However, officers began surveillance on Brooks almost immediately, tracking his movements, monitoring his interactions, and noting his behavior. Detectives noted the absence of typical concern. No calls to Crystal's family, no outreach on social media, no participation in search efforts. When asked why, Brooks simply stated, "I figured she'd come back when she was ready." Within 3 days, Crystal's case had already moved beyond a standard missing persons investigation. This was not a runaway. This was not a disappearance rooted in mental health or domestic confusion. She had left behind 5 children, one of them only a toddler. She missed family dinners, birthdays, and a 4th of July celebration she never would have skipped. She also left behind her medication, her wallet, and most telling of all, her dog. For those who knew her, that was the most unthinkable clue. By July 10th, detectives had begun to re-interview Brooks, this time with more direct forensic objectives. They requested access to his vehicle and property. He refused. His attorney began filtering all questions. The moment legal counsel appeared, the tone of the investigation changed. A decision was made to run full forensics on the Impala. DNA swabs were taken from the steering wheel, door handles, and seat belts. Luminol was applied to the interior cabin and trunk. No blood was found. Trace evidence, a single long blonde hair, was discovered wedged in the back seat seam. It was later confirmed to belong to Crystal, but its presence was unsurprising. She had driven the vehicle regularly. Nothing else stood out, and that became its own kind of warning. As one investigator later described it, it was too clean. That kind of clean only shows up when someone's covering something. Meanwhile, Crystal's phone data was being reconstructed by the Digital Forensic Unit. Her last GPS ping was captured at 7:19 p.m. on July 3rd, within city limits. After that, it went offline. The tower triangulation ended abruptly. That timing conflicted with Brooks's claim that she left the house much later, around midnight. That gap, nearly 5 hours, became the first-time discrepancy that couldn't be explained away. Brooks's public interviews, sparse and awkward, added pressure but not clarity. At one point, he stated in a local TV segment, "If I was involved in anything, I'd be in jail right now, but I'm not. So there's your answer." His tone was not defiant. It was something colder, measured, scripted. Investigators began mapping out Crystal's final known contacts. Her last confirmed text was to her cousin, noting she'd be home by evening. She never arrived. Her last online banking transaction was a debit charge for fuel that afternoon. She had made plans for the weekend. She had arranged childcare. She had a list of errands in her planner. Crystal had made no plans to disappear, but someone else had. At the end of the first week, a multi-agency task force was quietly formed. The FBI monitored from a distance, aware of prior cases in Bardstown that had spiraled into unsolved homicides. Crystal wasn't the first person to vanish under suspicious circumstances in Nelson County, but her case would soon become the one no one could ignore. In missing person cases, the first 72 hours define everything. For Crystal Rogers, that window had already closed, but what concerned investigators more than the time elapsed was the place she was last seen, her own home. The house at 495 Glenview Drive wasn't a crime scene. Not officially, but that didn't mean it wasn't hiding something. On July 6, 2015, a detective from the Nelson County Sheriff's Office requested a non-warrant walkthrough of the Houck residence. Brooks Houck agreed, on the condition that the visit be brief and not disruptive. The walkthrough lasted 14 minutes. No signs of forced entry, no blood, no displaced furniture, no indication that Crystal had packed a bag or left willingly. Her makeup and toiletries were untouched. A pair of flip-flops she was known to wear daily were still by the bedroom door. A half-drunk bottle of Diet Coke sat on the kitchen counter, flat and forgotten. There was nothing overt, but there was nothing right either. The officers took note of the surveillance DVR system mounted near the living room. When asked if the cameras had recorded anything from the night of July 3rd, Brooks claimed they were just dummies and not connected. That answer was later proven false. Investigators would find that the system had been operational just days prior. The footage from July 3rd and 4th, however, had been deleted. The deletion timestamp matched the morning of July 5th, just hours before Crystal's car was reported. It was enough to flag the home for deeper forensic review. Within 48 hours, the Kentucky State Police executed a limited-scope search warrant focused on the DVR system and digital devices. 2 desktops, 3 cell phones, a USB external hard drive, and the DVR box were seized. A forensic technician documented inconsistent deletion patterns on the DVR. Clips before July 3rd remained intact. Clips after July 5th existed, but that 48-hour window had been selectively wiped. The delete logs had been overwritten, indicating intentional, user-level manipulation, not a system malfunction. Crystal's own phone, already in evidence from the car, offered no further location data after 7:19 p.m. on July 3rd. Her phone's Bluetooth had connected to a familiar in-home speaker system just 12 minutes prior to that timestamp. This narrowed the window of her last known presence inside the house. Further analysis of the home's Wi-Fi logs provided another anomaly. At 1:37 a.m. on July 4th, a device labeled Unknown Device connected briefly to the home router. Its MAC address did not match any of the family's registered devices. The signal remained for just under 6 minutes, then disappeared. Investigators could not trace the device's owner, but its connection time frame overlapped with the supposed hours Crystal was still in the house. Investigators interviewed Brooks's brother, Nick Hoke, a Bardstown police officer. When asked whether he visited his brother that weekend, Nick denied any involvement. However, call logs revealed he had placed a 13-minute phone call to Brooks on July 5th, immediately following the sheriff's first contact regarding Crystal's disappearance. Nick's tone was described in internal notes as instructive, not sympathetic. Nick would later be compelled to take a polygraph by the Kentucky State Police. The results came back deceptive in key areas, especially questions related to assisting in concealing a crime. The Bardstown Police Department placed him on administrative leave. His service weapon and badge were surrendered. Behind closed doors, state investigators began building a behavioral profile on Brooks Hawk. He exhibited low reactivity demeanor, displayed scripted responses in interviews, and made no contact with Crystal's family. Forensic psychology consultants flagged his behavior as strategically withdrawn, suggesting possible knowledge of outcome or direct involvement. Despite this, legal limitations remained. Without a body, the case lacked a definitive physical crime scene. No bloodstains, no DNA conflict, no eyewitnesses, no weapon, and no confirmed point of death. Crystal was missing. She was not, by legal definition, dead. Even so, the command center treated the home as an indirect evidence source. A second, more comprehensive forensic sweep was conducted on July 15th. Cadaver dogs were brought in. In the master bedroom closet, one of the dogs showed a momentary alert, but the chemical analysis of the carpet fibers yielded no traceable blood proteins or human decomposition markers. The closet had recently been steam cleaned. The rental records from a local equipment store confirmed Brooks had rented a heavy-duty cleaner 2 days prior. At this point, the case's direction shifted from passive missing person to targeted digital forensics. A subpoena was filed for Brooks's Google and Apple location data. His phone showed a blank zone from 9:47 p.m. on July 3rd to 4:19 a.m. on July 4th. A tech blackout. No calls, no texts, no app use. That level of inactivity was flagged. It contrasted sharply with his typical usage pattern. A forensic investigator from KSP later noted, "People don't just shut off their entire digital existence for 7 hours unless they're sleeping, flying, or deleting something." Brooks claimed to have gone to bed around 10 p.m. and awakened at 7 a.m., but the time gaps in his activity didn't match that timeline. Investigators determined his device had likely been manually powered off and rebooted, not just left idle. Crystal's family continued their private search. They organized search parties near the Salt River and wooded areas east of Bardstown. They distributed missing person flyers across 5 counties. They pleaded for national media attention. But law enforcement remained quiet, building the case slowly, layer by layer. At this stage, no arrests had been made. No suspect had been named publicly. But inside the command center, the case board no longer featured question marks, just a series of dates, data points, and a photograph of a woman who was supposed to come home and never did. In towns like Bardstown, one investigator said, murders aren't just crimes. They break routine. They leave too much quiet where life used to be. The case against Brooks Houck wasn't built on a moment. It was built on silence, stacked, precise, and enforced. And it wasn't just the silence of a man whose girlfriend vanished. It was institutional. At the heart of it stood his brother, Officer Nick Huck, Bardstown Police Department. When Crystal Rogers disappeared in early July 2015, Nick wasn't assigned to the case. He wasn't called as backup. He wasn't even involved officially. But within 48 hours of the search beginning, his presence behind the scenes triggered immediate concern among Kentucky State Police. Phone records later obtained by subpoena showed a 13-minute call between Nick and Brooks on the morning of July 5th. Right after detectives from the Nelson County Sheriff's Office made their first inquiry at the Houck home, the timing raised a red flag. But it wasn't just when the call happened, it was what Nick did next. During an interview with state investigators, Nick claimed the call was routine, made out of brotherly concern. But the tone of the call, recovered from a recorded internal department line, indicated otherwise. Nick had warned Brooks not to speak with law enforcement without legal counsel. The phrase he used, "Don't let them trick you." It was a calculated obstruction, small on paper, large in implication. On July 15th, Kentucky State Police formally requested a polygraph from Nick Houck. He agreed. The test was administered by a certified examiner and monitored by an internal affairs officer. The results were not ambiguous. According to the report, Nick was deceptive on key questions relating to whether he had assisted in covering up a crime or disposing of evidence. Within a week, Nick Houck was placed on administrative leave by the Bardstown Police Department. His badge and sidearm were surrendered. By October, after a disciplinary review, he was terminated. The final report cited interference with an active homicide investigation. Publicly, the department downplayed internal conflict. Privately, the damage was done. For the Rogers family, it confirmed what they had feared, that the system intended to protect had been compromised. Meanwhile, Kentucky State Police investigators began reviewing all prior contact between Nick and the Crystal Rogers case. One connection stood out. In late June 2015, just a week before Crystal's disappearance, Nick had been seen at the Glenview Drive property. When asked, Brooks described it as a casual drop-in. But neighbors recalled Nick's truck remaining in the driveway for over an hour, late into the evening. No details of the visit were recorded. No reason was ever provided. Investigators cross-checked digital data from that night. Nick's personal cell phone pinged a tower adjacent to Brooks' residence during the time in question. His police department registered phone, however, was turned off between 9:18 p.m. and 12:03 a.m. That alone wasn't illegal, but it was deliberate and, in context, deeply suspicious. Forensic technicians reanalyzed security device firmware pulled from Brooks's residence. Logs indicated the home's surveillance DVR was accessed externally, via mobile device, on the same night Nick visited. The IP address matched a device later linked to Nick's department-issued laptop. The conclusion, someone familiar with the surveillance system and with motive had previewed or manipulated its content. As part of the expanded investigation, internal documents from Bardstown PD were subpoenaed. One entry in a vehicle log showed Nick's cruiser had undergone an unscheduled deep clean on July 7th. The detailing order included upholstery steam treatment and carpet extraction. When questioned, Nick claimed he had spilled coffee. No incident report supported that. The cruiser was later examined under ultraviolet and chemical analysis. Luminol indicated possible protein presence in the trunk compartment. However, samples were too degraded to confirm biological origin. The department had not preserved the vehicle for forensic retention, standard procedure for non-criminal maintenance. It was a loss of potential evidence. For investigators, Nick's role shifted from peripheral obstruction to active suspect in a broader pattern of concealment. But without a body and with circumstantial evidence falling just short of probable cause, the case stalled. The risk of pushing for indictment too early could compromise the integrity of the entire operation. So the team waited, methodically building a profile and continuing surveillance. By August, Brooks had retained a defense attorney. All communications were routed through legal counsel. He refused further interviews. Nick did the same. Without their cooperation, law enforcement turned to secondary witnesses, friends, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who might break the deadlock. One neighbor, interviewed under sealed affidavit, stated they had noticed unusual traffic at the Houck property between July 3rd and July 6th. Specifically, they saw a white utility trailer parked in the driveway on the evening of July 4th, then gone by dawn. That trailer, the witness said, was not a familiar vehicle to the property. It had no markings and was seen only once. Its relevance remained speculative, but a trace was opened. The Rogers family, increasingly isolated from official updates, pressed local media for attention. Sherry Ballard, Crystal's mother, appeared on camera stating, "We're not going away. We want answers. We want the truth, no matter who it involves." State investigators kept their response measured. Internally, they faced dual pressure to avoid missteps in an already politically sensitive case and to ensure that any future charges would withstand court scrutiny. By September, the FBI had been briefed on all developments. They were not yet leading the case, but their behavioral analysis unit began preliminary profiling. Their internal memo noted the presence of collusive behavior involving a law enforcement officer and flagged the need for sealed warrants and confidential witness protection should the case escalate. One forensic agent summarized it plainly. When the badge is dirty, the crime scene gets larger. On the morning of November 19, 2016, just over a year after Crystal Rogers vanished, her father, Tommy Ballard, was shot once through the chest while preparing for a routine hunting trip with his 12-year-old grandson. It happened off Bluegrass Parkway, the same corridor where Crystal's car had been found parked, keys still in the ignition. There were no witnesses, no surveillance, no shell casing recovered, just a single entrance wound and a lifeless body in the early frost. The bullet had entered at a downward angle, piercing the sternum. The coroner ruled it a homicide, not an accident, but stopped short of naming suspects. That silence, again, left the family to draw conclusions alone. Tommy had not been a passive bystander to his daughter's disappearance. He organized private searches, spoke to reporters, tracked vehicle movements, photographed potential dump sites, and passed every piece of information he could to law enforcement. In the months before his death, he had compiled a personal case file, maps, notes, photos, printed call logs. He believed someone was watching him. He told relatives more than once, "They want me gone." Investigators confirmed he had recently installed motion-activated trail cameras around his property. Forensic analysis of the scene returned limited results. The entry wound's trajectory was downward, suggesting a shot from elevation or from a person standing on a ridge. No elevated stands were nearby. The 243 caliber round fragmented upon entry and could not be traced. Gunpowder residue on Tommy's hands was consistent with an attempted reflexive movement, not a self-inflicted shot. There was no suicide note, no known health issues, no history of depression. He had made appointments for the following week. He had just ordered Thanksgiving supplies. The Kentucky State Police opened a separate homicide investigation. No suspects were named. No arrests followed. Investigators could not confirm whether his murder was directly connected to Crystal's disappearance, but internally, the cases were not treated as separate. Digital forensic teams analyzed Tommy's phone and laptop. No threatening texts, no digital trail of confrontation. But his browsing history showed regular visits to case forums, and he had bookmarked a property listing near the Houck family's land, an area he apparently believed held relevance. That property had been up for sale since early 2016. Tommy had inquired, but never purchased. The working theory developed among law enforcement was that his death had strategic impact. It disrupted a secondary investigation. It severed the most vocal advocate for Crystal's case, and it shifted public attention away from the stalled investigation and toward an untraceable, single-shot killing. Strategically, it silenced two victims. Months after Tommy's death, an anonymous tip was received via the FBI's digital submission line. The sender claimed to have overheard a conversation about the father getting too close. The message was sent from a public IP address and could not be verified. Still, the phrasing aligned with a persistent pattern, one that investigators noted but could not yet prove. In small towns, justice isn't just about truth. It's about who is willing to keep pushing when the evidence runs thin. Tommy had pushed harder than anyone, and when he died, the entire case took a colder, quieter tone. The command center restructured. The FBI increased involvement but withheld public acknowledgement. Federal analysts flagged the Ballard shooting as highly targeted, and although no one said it aloud, everyone inside the room understood what it meant. This wasn't random. In August 2020, 5 years after Crystal Rogers disappeared, and 4 years after her father was gunned down in broad daylight, the case moved quietly but definitively into federal hands. The FBI didn't arrive with sirens or televised statements. They showed up with search warrants, forensic techs, and sealed case files. And they didn't ask for help. They took the lead. Their first action was a full reassessment of the evidence, from the Impala found on the parkway to the deleted surveillance footage in digital device logs. But they didn't stop there. They began reprocessing previously dismissed leads using updated tools, location triangulation, digital footprint expansion, and behavioral analysis. This wasn't a second opinion, it was a total restart. On August 6th, agents served multiple federal search warrants simultaneously. The homes of Brooks Houck, Nick Houck, and other properties linked to the family were searched. Trucks, computers, backup devices, storage lockers, all cataloged, all seized. One of the most significant forensic discoveries came from a concrete slab at a rental property previously owned by Brooks. Ground-penetrating radar detected subsurface disturbances, indicating that the area had once been dug, refilled, and poured over. Soil samples were taken. Biological material was found. Though degraded, mitochondrial DNA testing confirmed a female sample. It wasn't enough for identification, but enough to change the tone of the investigation. For the first time, the FBI officially labeled Crystal's case a homicide. The Bureau also obtained historical cell tower data, previously considered inconclusive. With new location software, they reanalyzed the movement of Brooks's phone during the disappearance window. Contrary to his original claim, his phone had traveled briefly east of Bardstown, then disconnected for over 2 hours before reconnecting near his home. The area where the phone went dark, now identified, was less than 2 miles from the concrete slab. FBI behavioral profilers reviewed the digital behavior of key individuals during that time. The focus wasn't just on what they posted, but what they deleted. Dozens of messages, social media posts, and private communications disappeared between July 4th and July 6, 2015. Forensic restoration recovered fragments, enough to suggest coordination. Witnesses who had once declined to speak under local jurisdiction began cooperating under federal protection. One individual confirmed seeing a vehicle matching Brooks's truck near the rental property on the night of July 3rd. Another confirmed hearing a gunshot that same night, but had been too afraid to report it. What the FBI brought wasn't just new resources. It was distance from local politics, pressure, and past mistakes. The agency's approach was methodical, not theatrical, and while they made no public accusations, their presence alone signaled a shift. Someone would be held accountable. Bardstown was no longer just the backdrop. It was part of the investigation. By mid-2023, the FBI's case file on Crystal Rogers contained over 2,000 pages, cross-referenced phone logs, surveillance gaps, financial transactions, GPS metadata, ground-penetrating radar readouts, and interview transcripts. But what finally broke the next layer of silence wasn't data. It was a name: Joseph Lawson. In September 2023, federal agents arrested Lawson on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence in connection to Crystal Rogers' case. The arrest was not publicized in advance. It came after months of quiet surveillance and a sealed indictment. Lawson wasn't a high-profile figure in Bardstown. He was 32 years old with no prior violent criminal record, but he had a history that placed him in proximity to the case. He worked in contracting and had occasionally assisted with property maintenance for Brooks Houck. More notably, his father, Stephen Lawson, had long-standing connections to multiple individuals under federal scrutiny. Agents obtained a warrant to search Joseph's home and personal vehicle. Digital forensics revealed that in July 2015, Lawson's phone had pinged in the same vicinity as Brooks Houck's during the key disappearance window. More importantly, forensic examiners recovered fragments of deleted messages exchanged with a contact listed only as B, later confirmed as Brooks. One of the recovered messages, time-stamped July 4, 2015 at 12:31 a.m., read, "Got it moved. They won't find it." It wasn't enough to determine the exact object referred to, but the context aligned with investigative timelines. Combined with the location overlap and phone shutdown periods, it marked Lawson as a key participant. Lawson was interviewed under federal custody, but did not confess. He invoked his right to remain silent. Still, prosecutors believed the pattern of circumstantial evidence, including geolocation logs, corroborating witness testimony, and the recovered digital communications, was strong enough to support a conspiracy charge. 2 weeks later, Stephen Lawson was also indicted. He faced the same charges. Investigators believed he had assisted in cleanup and transportation. While specific forensic evidence linking him directly to a crime scene remained thin, witness statements placed him near the disturbed property location in the early morning hours of July 4, 2015. One of the most damning details came from a construction equipment rental invoice dated July 3, 2015. The document listed Stephen Lawson as the lessee of a portable concrete mixer. It was returned 2 days later, cleaned but missing its original registration tag. The rental yard hadn't reported it missing until the FBI showed them the copy. The slab that had tested positive for degraded biological material in Chapter 5? That slab was poured within 48 hours of the rental return. In the following months, federal agents began presenting preliminary findings to a grand jury. Their argument didn't rely on a single confession or isolated act. It relied on coordination. The movement of devices, the overlap of timelines, the intentional digital gaps, and now third-party actors. It was no longer a story of one man and one missing woman. It was a network structured, silent, and rooted in a town that had learned how to look away. From a broader perspective, cases like this don't just test forensic capabilities. They test patience. They test the limits of what a family can endure when answers are always out of reach and justice moves in inches. Crystal's body still hadn't been found, but her name was back on court dockets. Her case was back in headlines. And the people once thought untouchable were facing the start of accountability. By October 2023, the investigation into Crystal Rogers' disappearance had entered a decisive phase. With Joseph and Stephen Lawson formally charged and federal agents continuing to map out coordination, prosecutors moved to prepare the case for a grand jury. The timeline, long fragmented, was now being reconstructed with one goal: legal accountability. The Department of Justice, alongside the FBI's Evidence Response Team, compiled a prosecutorial brief outlining every verified movement, message, and forensic anomaly. Each data point wasn't just presented, it had to be authenticated, contextualized, and tied to a timeline that a jury could follow without ambiguity. Unlike public speculation, federal cases are not built on intuition. They are built on sequence, logic, and the weight of corroborated facts. Among the evidence reviewed was a newly surfaced digital photograph recovered from a synced cloud account linked to Joseph Lawson. It had been deleted in 2015 but remained stored on a secondary device. The image showed a burned clearing, time-stamped within 36 hours of Crystal's disappearance, located near the area where the concrete slab had been poured. FBI analysts verified the coordinates. Local aerial footage from the same date confirmed unusual nighttime activity in that region. Headlights captured on thermal drone scans operated during early search efforts. Investigators didn't stop with physical or digital leads. They returned to key witnesses who had previously declined cooperation under local pressure. Under federal subpoena, one witness disclosed they had seen a tarp-covered object being moved between two vehicles on the Lawson property in the early hours of July 4, 2015. The object was never recovered, but the statement aligned with previous gaps in phone movement and security footage from adjacent properties. Meanwhile, prosecutors faced the delicate task of navigating the no-body problem. Though they now had circumstantial alignment, mitochondrial DNA, and digital records suggesting cover-up, Crystal's remains had still not been located. Grand jury instructions would need to carefully define how circumstantial evidence can establish homicide beyond a reasonable doubt, even in the absence of a body. The prosecution team leaned heavily on digital forensics. Data trails didn't just show movement, they showed intent to conceal. Patterns of deleted communications, overlapping device shutdowns, and location tracking revealed planning, not panic. Bardstown, meanwhile, was fracturing. Rumors resurfaced. Families split down lines of belief and denial. The courthouse lawn saw candle vigils and protests, both calling for justice and for silence. For Crystal's family, the coming indictment wasn't closure. It wasn't even a full answer. But it was momentum, and in a case that had stalled for 8 years, movement itself felt like progress. On September 27, 2023, after more than 8 years of silence, circumstantial fragments, and mounting forensic reconstruction, Brooks Houck was formally indicted by a Nelson County grand jury for the murder of Crystal Rogers and tampering with physical evidence. The indictment was sealed until his arrest. He was taken into custody without incident and held on a $10 million cash bond. The charges marked the first time in the case's history that someone directly connected to Crystal had been accused of killing her, despite her body never being found. The court documents did not detail every piece of evidence publicly, but they referenced a course of conduct consistent with planning, concealment, and digital manipulation. What federal investigators had spent 3 years assembling, across thousands of pages of data logs, device pings, cloud backups, and witness interviews, had now been distilled into 2 charges. But behind those charges sat an infrastructure of digital forensics rarely visible in rural homicide cases. The core of the prosecution's strategy didn't rest on a single breakthrough. It rested on convergence, multiple data points from separate sources, forming a consistent pattern of deception: the false alibis, the deleted surveillance footage, the unaccounted rental equipment, the buried slab, the anonymous tips, and the Lawson connection. The indictment also reflected a deeper shift: the justice system's increasing reliance on digital footprints to prosecute cases where physical evidence is missing, altered, or intentionally destroyed. In Crystal's case, there was no recovered weapon, no confirmed crime scene, and no body. But there was motive, there was opportunity, and there was behavior. After the arrest, prosecutors emphasized that the case would proceed under Kentucky law, which allows homicide prosecution without a body if evidence supports the charge beyond reasonable doubt. Crystal's family, though devastated by the delay, expressed public gratitude. Her mother stated simply, "We waited. We never stopped." In the months that followed, Joseph and Stephen Lawson agreed to cooperate in plea arrangements. While specific terms remained sealed, federal filings confirmed that both men provided information material to the development of the state's case. Forensic analysts revisited multiple statements and reevaluated overlapping GPS zones. In one post-arrest interview, a cooperating party confirmed that Crystal had been declared handled by the early morning hours of July 4, 2015. The terminology, detached, procedural, was cited in pretrial hearings as indicative of premeditation. The trial for Brooks Houck is scheduled for early 2026. His defense has denied all allegations and moved to suppress several categories of evidence. No formal statement has been made by him since the day of his arrest. He remains in custody at the time of this report. As of May 2025, Crystal Rogers' remains have not been recovered. Despite that, the indictment represents a rare achievement in homicide prosecution, where law enforcement must prove not just who committed the crime, but that the crime occurred at all without a physical body. These cases demand precision, restraint, and absolute command over digital timelines. And beyond that, they demand persistence. The kind shown not by a single officer or one moment of luck, but by years of work across departments, jurisdictions, and technologies. And by a family that refused to forget. In cases like Crystal's, justice rarely looks like closure. It's measured not in confessions or quick endings, but in accountability, however long it takes to reach. The absence of a body doesn't erase a life. It doesn't invalidate grief, and it doesn't stop the truth from surfacing. Sometimes it takes years for the legal system to catch up with reality, but when it does so one piece at a time, and with the weight of everything it couldn't ignore. In the end, what this case taught me is simple. Silence doesn't mean peace, and time doesn't mean justice. As someone who's watched this unfold year after year, I've learned that the people who push forward, quietly, steadily, are the ones who keep truth alive. If you're holding on to something in your life that no one else sees or believes, don't let go. Keep asking questions. Keep showing up. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you take away from this case? What would justice look like to you if the evidence isn't physical, but the pain is real? If this story moved you or made you think, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Or tell me what parts didn't sit right. I read everything. And if you want more real stories that hit hard and matter, don't forget to subscribe to this channel.